not really waiting for like the revolution, you know. I think the revolution is what we make of it. And you can view it as a single instance of sort of massive social and economic change, or you can understand the revolution as banding together with your neighbors to get somebody's security deposit back, or fighting for these policies that maybe are not transformational in the short term, but in the aggregate over the long term can actually be disruptive. My hope on my podcast, like I said, is to get into all sorts of different sort of prescriptions or ideas about manageable ways for us to claw back private space and increase democratic control over urban space, which is desperately needed.
Hi.
Hello.
How do we do this? Do we begin with introductions?
Yeah, I think that would be good. Well, my name is Rynn, and I host a podcast called Zoned Out. It's a monthly podcast that examines cities from a socialist or left-wing perspective. And so most of my episodes so far have been kind of centered around like deconstructing the city, how it's understood under capitalism, how we can understand it generally outside of the capitalist framework. And, you know, into the new year, my hope is to actually kind of get into some topics about positive visions of what a more just city looks like. So far, my bread and butter has just been deconstructing the capitalist city to know what's going on now, to understand how we can change for the better.
So, as a Sunrise Movement activist, my name is Stephen Wallace. I participate in Sunrise Movement. My chapter is Annapolis, Maryland. We're small, but we're steady. One of the niches that I found is just gathering information like this. When I think about analysis of the capitalist city, it applies in the context of what Sunrise Movement is doing because of I would say, the New Deal aspect of the Green New Deal is what we're fighting for. And in fact, I think some of the movement to advance public housing is kind of, we talk about Green New Deal for public housing or Green New Deal for housing. That's one of the areas to start. And this gets into this whole domain of politics, which I think is, I wouldn't say misunderstood, but I'd say the common knowledge is lacking for a number of reasons, right? And this has resulted in problems for advancing public housing projects for a number of reasons. So everybody, like my friend Josh, who is also an urban planner on YouTube, he told me something that I thought was quite insightful. And this is probably the best place to begin to ask for your insight. He found that when left-wingers and progressives are lacking knowledge, they'll go for what's lying around. And when it comes to urban development, what's lying around is the neoliberal norm.
Mm-hmm. The way I see like my podcast and other people kind of working in the space of approaching our communities from a left-wing perspective or the built environment, I kind of understand it as last mile politics, if you will. Despite focusing on a local context, I actually don't have particular preference about the scale at which organizing or political action happens, especially right now for the left in this country, in the United States. We need to be able to seize opportunities wherever they arise. And that only comes from preparation at a variety of scales. I do think it's important to be having conversations about our political goals across geographic scale. And whether or not it's fighting for Medicare for all, a federal jobs guarantee, public housing, all of these ideas get metabolized down at the local level by most people, even if the political action is happening at a statewide or national or international level. Same with trends in the economy. And this is something that I talk about on my show, is how the ease with which capital can be made liquid ever since the Carter administration has had international consequences on capital flow. And it's how we wind up with the Saudi and Emirati sovereign wealth funds funding ghost kitchens in Miami. There are these international trends happening, but you know, when a ghost kitchen pops up in somebody's neighborhood in Miami, they're not thinking, oh, geez, SoftBank's venture capital fund is really making some poor moves. They're like, I need to contact the mayor. I don't like this new building. Or, you know, it gets metabolized on like a local level. And so I call my podcast like last mile politics, because in transportation planning, you can kind of divide up any trip within a city, in sort of distinct parts. You have the beginning part when you are at your starting location, going to your main type of transportation. And then there's like the main part of the trip where you're going from point A to point B. But then there's the last mile leg of your trip where you're going from the transportation that you used to your final destination. That could be from your car in the parking lot to work, from the bus stop to your house. That part of transportation oftentimes gets overlooked, but is immensely important. The same can be said for having a coherent local level analysis of different policies that we may be approaching at all geographic scales. I think there's been a lack of conversation up until recently in the mainstream left discourse, anyway. And that's not a harsh critique. The left in this country is still rebuilding after a century of getting beat down by capital and right wing forces. And so I don't think we need to be too hard on ourselves for not having everything together all at once already. But I think over the long term, it's important to contend with cities as a site of political struggle and implementation for policies that we champion.
Well said. When I think about areas where there has been some city level engagement, local engagement, other YouTubers, like Not Just Bikes and whoever else, pop up with these nice ideas, come in, walkable cities, etc. It's not like there's nothing there, because a lot of what you speak to lends to a lot of what they're talking about as well, going beyond car exclusive modes of transportation, hopefully designing things in a way that makes a city a manageable place to live. When I think about urban movement politics that is familiar in the United States, it's impossible not to think about the YIMBY thing.
And NIMBYs.
And the NIMBYs too. And this binary opposition is very interesting because if you're opposed to YIMBYs, you're often thought of as being a left-wing NIMBY. I've heard this, or some kind of like you're a reductionist of some kind. And there has to be a way to understand this dynamic that goes beyond this kind of opposition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I see NIMBYs and YIMBYs as kind of reflecting two sides of people who have the most stake in real estate capital, the most investment in the maintenance of the status quo of sort of a commodified land and housing system, because the NIMBYs tend to be wealthier, generally white homeowners in segregated areas of the city that don't want to see not even low income housing, but literally any density, because they associate density with lower property values or a different demographic of people, read poor or non-white, coming into their community. It goes back to not only their desires for sort of social exclusion, but also just an investment in the concept of property values in general. This can impact people at all levels of homeownership, because once you buy a home, you are invested in the concept of commodified property. But of course, the people who are living in really valuable properties are going to be even more invested. But then on the other side with the YIMBYs, you have real estate capital. And these are people and firms that are interested in managing large portfolios of commercial and residential real estate for the purpose of extracting rents. So it's really two sides of capital kind of duking it out, which, like, what is American politics, the mainstream anyway, if not two sides of capital duking it out? And so I think the left has a pretty good critique of this if people are willing to access it, which is that a lot of the time, a left-wing NIMBY, right, that term really gets thrown around when development that constitutes gentrification is up for debate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you don't see left-wingers coming out arguing against market rate apartments in wealthy suburbs. Again, using the terminology of like a left-wing NIMBY, right, if there is such a thing. You find left-wing people mostly concerned about issues of justice. I think it's pretty cheap critique of people who are fighting to keep people in their homes to say that we are just universally opposed to new development. So I've done a lot of like community engagement work at the local level. A lot of the time, especially when you get into areas that are already kind of dense, like inner ring suburbs, the concept of density and develop is not foreign to people. And so they're not opposed to the concept of it. But if they keep seeing their friends and family members and the local businesses, organizations that they've frequented for decades get pushed out, then their opposition is not to the new development, it's to the underlying system that allows for displacement to occur. Density doesn't cause displacement. It's the underlying economic system that allows rent and for-profit housing to exist and homelessness to exist. I think it's mostly obfuscation to just kind of brand the people who are opposed to gentrification as NIMBYs. I think that's putting it generously, that it's obfuscation. It's,
Here come the attack of the dogmas, the familiar slogans come out. This analysis is very nice, but this is the system we live in. So maybe it's some future time. When I, just by instinct, I go, what about programs like Housing First or the Vienna style social housing? I kind of dream of that thing. I think that if it happens in the world, it could happen here in the United States. But again, here come the attack of the dogmas, where somebody goes, not in our lifetime is this going to happen. Or they'll conceal that belief in the following way. They'll go, well, I certainly agree with that as an option among all of these other options, all of the above. Let's go ahead and do this. We'll have a social housing program over here, in addition to all of these other solutions, right? D, all of the above. And what tends to happen, as far as I know, it's kind of like Obamacare with the single payer thing. The public option was never going to happen. And so when you say all of the above, what you mean really is all of the existing capitalist options, and that serious consideration of anything outside of that is going to be maligned.
Yeah, not just maligned, but ignored, because the reality is that the for-profit land system, whether it is homeownership or renting, regardless, relies on a population's fear of going without shelter, going without a basic human need. Homelessness, houselessness, the term gets used interchangeably in a lot of circles these days, but homelessness is baked into the system and is necessary to discipline renters and even homeowners, because people have to make their mortgage payments. I feel like homelessness is there to discipline renters, to make sure that renters pay absurd levels of rent to have a roof over their heads.
It's a message. It's
exactly. And so the idea that it can have this sort of all of the above strategy and throw in social housing or quote unquote affordable housing, which in this country is a joke, it is wildly insufficient. I'm not saying I would ever fight against a subsidized housing development going in because the system is insufficient. As soon as you introduce the concept of affordability into a housing system, you introduce means testing, and you have to answer the question, well, how much rent is fair? That cap has crept up over time with our subsidized housing in this country. We're looking now at anywhere from 30 to 35% of income for being considered the cap for what is considered affordable. If you're paying less than a third of your income towards housing, you're not considered like rent burdened or housing burdened. But like, I have to ask, do people want to be paying 30% of their income towards housing? Like, should we be satisfied with that? I would argue no. So anyway, to get back to your point about the all of the above strategy, the problem of homelessness, of rent burden, necessarily cannot be solved under a capitalist system because it's what disciplines people into participating in it in the first place. If we had an abundance of no income housing, not just low income, but no income housing where you don't have to pay a dime to live there, then suddenly extracting rent from people becomes a lot more difficult. And so we can't have a solution to this problem as long as there's an intense investment as a capitalist housing system as the primary form of housing in this country. I think if we get to a point where everybody has a guaranteed roof over their head, everybody's home is, good quality and meets the needs of their family or group unit that wants to live there, then sure, we can have sort of a vestigial secondary property market, maybe, but we've put the like everything under capitalism, the profit motive, ahead of human need in our housing system. A lot of people are willing to say that, use that sort of verbiage, but the only way that we're actually going to put human need ahead of profit is to solve the problems that discipline people into participating in the exploitation to begin with.
So there are two areas in which one might begin solving this problem, as far as I can see. As far as I know, there are legal barriers to actualizing universal housing. You're not even allowed to build public housing. Is it the Faircloth Amendment or something like that? And the other thing is just the political sense, or let's say the dominating ideology says, this is just how this is. And altering that, when people say, look, we live in this system now, maybe one day, 100, 200 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
My argument against that has been, but this isn't a matter of time, it's a matter of material relations.
Mm-hmm.
And if you understand that it's a matter of influence of material interest, then this dogma about not at this time or whatever, it's just a talking point. It actually doesn't really mean anything.
No, absolutely not. I mean, if not now, then when? You mentioned Vienna earlier. It's something like 60% of the population of Vienna lives in some form of subsidized housing. Some of it is fully public, where the state operates it. Others, especially over the past few decades, it's been sort of a shift to like public-private partnership towards really intensely subsidized housing. I have to say, if you're going to do subsidized housing, which we do have in the United States, we should be doing it like Vienna, where, people are paying $300 to live in a good apartment a month, which again, that's still means testing. That's still not my ideal, but it's a way better cap on rent than what we see here. That tradition and that investment in that system was born out of the intense hard work of the left movement in, Red Vienna early in the 20th century. Those moments don't happen out of the blue. We need to be agitating for these things, even when there's not an opportunity right in front of us, because what matters is the preparation to be able to seize opportunities when they do arise. And these moments do come up. Capitalism generates crises all the time and at an increasing rate these days. And a lot of people are pissed off at their landlords, are pissed off at the fact that if you want to buy a home these days, people know that it's absurdly high. There's not any evidence that the quality of the housing stock has increased or that homes are getting bigger or there's some sort of material justification for these increased prices. And of course, wages haven't increased alongside them, right? People, the contradictions are mounting. Young people who look at this system that, we're inheriting and it's just like, what do we even do with this? I think it's ridiculous to say not now. We need to keep preparing, even if the moment is not right this moment, because moments of opportunity come and they go, right? The most recent one that people could latch onto is like the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. And I know there are legitimate critiques of Bernie Sanders and his politics overall, but come on, this is an opportunity where, like, if we had more time to prepare, we could have met that opportunity and had a different outcome, maybe.
Well, he totally has changed the national culture. I don't think the condition for us to even think of talking to each other wouldn't arise without this. And I have to say, in my heart, here was a national program. Here was this nationwide intervention, ideological intervention, imperfect as it is, right?
Yeah.
We destigmatized the notion of anti-capitalist consensus.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's something that's going to stick with me for the rest of my life, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the problem now doesn't exist in knowledge alone, but the political willpower is easily diffused just because of attention and life. I always think like, wow, Red Vienna comes to the United States. What an idea. What a wonderful thing. Then you just open your eyes a little bit wider and you see, wow, look at this. All of these cities have, the consumer culture influences a lot of what a city is as a concept, as a reality. The notion of what the American dream is would be challenged by the intervention of universal housing. Here's what comes to mind now is it's maybe some coalition of, if you're going to start it in one area, maybe start with tenants unions coming together to form a larger coalition. They would form a consensus in general, right? And from there, maybe you could push for a demand. But it's difficult for the same reason that any universal-esque policy, whether it's healthcare or housing, it's difficult because the common sense of our system is so hell-bent on rewarding everybody staying in their own lane and keeping things alone. The YIMBY compromise, I'm going to call it a compromise between universal housing and total outright displacement, has some interesting, I mean, I think architectural designs like in MoCo, which we're talking about, the missing middle and all of that, I think that is oriented toward a mode of relation which is genuinely healthier, but it doesn't attack this underlying problem, right? It doesn't get to the root of this thing, which is you need to get a solution for the homeless problem, which is outside of the market, right? Are there instances of this demand that you can see being articulated in the United States?
Yeah. So one concept that I think is really easy, if you want to get involved in a very tangible way, there are a couple different things that you can do. So you mentioned tenants unions, and tenants unions have been having a moment for the past few years. When I was in college, 5, 6 years ago now, I helped found the tenants union in my college town. I don't know that it's still active now because a college town in particular is really difficult to have like a sustained tenants union. I mean, just organization in general, because there's so much population turnover. Like you do need people who are committed to like build things and shepherd an organization off the ground before it becomes self-sustaining. But chances are, if you live in any city of a decent size, you've got a tenants union now, and you can join them and get involved with tenant organizing. Tenants unions right now, the victories we saw were literally having bodies present to advocate for renters who were getting screwed over by their landlords, not getting their security deposits back or needing repairs to be made. So that is like a concrete way to push back. I live in a place where like sort of the tenant movement has gotten large enough, I guess, that there's a whole tenant resource center. There are opportunities to, if you know about tenant or housing law, to help educate people about their rights under the current system. And that can be really helpful as well. If you help people in a tangible way, right? I was working with the tenants union in my college town. We weren't really helping members of the union. We were helping people that we heard about who needed help. And once you kind of help people in a tangible way, it gets them aware of and interested in your organization and creates that buy-in.
Once they experience a change in their life, they're like,
exactly.
How far can we go?
Right. There are more and more tenant groups popping up. And literally, like, if there isn't one in your area, you can just start a tenants union. You can just do that, just kind of wing it and make it happen. But it's going to be worthwhile in the long run to do that, even if you just get one person's security deposit back. I'm also really inspired by housing trusts. Housing trusts, again, exist not outside the market-based system, but depending on what you're talking about, whether it's like a private or like a city-run housing trust, I think there's the potential for those to transform into really disruptive entities. So if it's sort of a nonprofit trust, they probably have a portfolio of housing that they hold on to in the trust that basically prevents the cost of it from going up by more than a certain percentage point every time the house changes hand. So housing trust homes oftentimes will be like bizarrely and wildly below market rate because the organization is dedicated to keeping them relatively affordable, or at least sheltering them from like the most absurd excesses of the market. Public housing trusts or land trusts are also really great if they're done correctly. I think sometimes they just become sort of waiting rooms for vacant property to eventually be donated to like nonprofit housing developers or even sold off for private development. But under the right circumstances with the right political leadership, a robust housing trust becomes the starting point for new public housing, or at least heavily subsidized housing. At least where I live, there is like a nonprofit housing trust. So seeing if there are ways to get involved with that, I think is worthwhile. And then lastly, This is quaint and maybe seems mundane, but don't underestimate the power of just getting to know your neighbors. We are increasingly atomized in this country and under capitalism. The number of people in this country who, or the proportion of people in this country who don't know any of their neighbors, that's increasing. The number of people who don't count any of their neighbors as a friend is increasing. And I'm not saying that like making friends or talking to your neighbors is going to transform things on its own. But if you want to organize your fellow renters in your apartment complex against your landlord from a rent increase, it really helps if you already know them and you have those social bonds built up. And I think ultimately, from my perspective, if we're fighting for a just city, I want to feel invested in the community that I'm in. I want to fight not just for myself, but for my friends, found family. I don't live anywhere with my blood family, but I don't want to leave them out too. I do care about them too. But what are we doing if we don't have strong social bonds that we're fighting for? The connections that you make with the people who live around you can be the basis for action down the line.
It's like you say it, and I'm like, that's right. It's the same feeling as, wow, this was inside me all along, right? Which is kind of what political empowerment is supposed to lead you to. This can come from us. In that way, we can be kind of extricated from the need for a savior, looking for a political hero outside of ourselves. One of the areas that I think would be beneficial to talk to about is what are the linkages between, say, fighting for a more progressive policy in regards to housing and fighting for more progressive policies in regards to transportation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they go hand in hand. If we start with transportation, transportation is a really popular jumping off point for people interested in a progressive vision of the city. It can also be the end point for a lot of people, but all of us, basically, if you live outside of New York in the United States or like any of the really big cities that are sufficiently dense, you feel the frustration of having to own a car to get anywhere. And if you ever have been outside the United States, again, in Europe, or my girlfriend like worked in Japan, you experience a different way of how cities are organized and not needing a car to get anywhere really. And you can't help but feel like we're missing out in the United States. Um,
To say the least.
yeah, I mean, and it is an issue of justice. One of the first things that like literally in like the promo or like introductory episode of my podcast, one thing that I talk about is that car dependence is not just an issue of form, but it's also an issue of capitalist exploitation. One more example of how financialized our economy has become, because of course, if you own a car, you're making car payments to whoever loaned you the money to purchase the car. And that's a really lucrative business. And it's also literally the built environment mandating that you take out a loan if you want to get around with any reasonable degree of expediency. And so it's a great thing for auto manufacturers and financial institutions to force people into these financial arrangements. And of course, auto manufacturers like GM, this is something that David Harvey points out in The Right to the City. GM Financial, the wing of the GM Corporation, General Motors Corporation, that handles things like car loan payments, fees, and things like that. In total dollars is still not the largest proportion of GM's total profits, but the rate of profit is way higher. GM companies, the actual auto manufacturers' rate of profit is like 2%. GM Financial is like 19%, which is an absurdly high rate of profit. That is how financialization manifests itself as capital searches for venues for profit as the rate overall declines. And so our built environment can not just be understood as kind of impractical in a practical sense of how we get around, but also if we design our cities to allow for public transit to be efficiently utilized by everybody, then that unshackles us from a requirement of entering these financial arrangements that are highly exploitative.
Challenges capitalist reality altogether.
Exactly. And it's not just public transit, it's of course walkability and bikeability. And these intersect with issues of disability rights. But the reality is with public transportation is that there is a degree of density that you need for it to be efficiently provided and sufficiently accessible for people. The reason that we don't have buses in the suburbs is because it would be financially, genuinely quite difficult to send a bus down every curvilinear street of large lot single family homes because you want to have bus stops frequent enough and like close enough to where people are living and working to be able to be accessed. That's why density and public transit go hand in hand. The trouble is what we see nowadays. People who advocate for higher density and sort of a change in the urban form to allow for more public transit are oftentimes real estate developers. The trouble now is that oftentimes gentrification is accompanied by improvements in public transit, otherwise good interventions in the transit system to make it less car dependent. You might see nicer bike lanes, wider sidewalks, more bike parking, and improvements in the availability of public transit. These should be things that can happen without corresponding increases in rent and property values that end up pushing people out of their homes. Because what is most frustrating for people who work in local government, who genuinely want to provide services to people and people who need them the most with an equity lens, is that the enhanced public service, whether it's public transit or improvements at the local park or a new library branch or a new public health facility or what have you, is being aware that these interventions could be the thing that sets off a gentrification cycle in
Right.
the area you're trying to help. And so it's this really perverse system of public improvement designed to help people and
My,
provide a genuine service, backfiring.
my roommate produced an incredibly funny ad hominem about this morning because we were talking about how I was going to get this talk. And he said, it's capitalists on bikes going to their bullshit jobs.
Yeah, seriously, we have to ask if gentrification is allowed to occur alongside all of these genuinely good transit improvements, then who's going to be accessing this new transit? It's people who probably otherwise could have afforded a car, but due to the nature of the built environment, are choosing to use the bus. There are people, in spite of how car-centric our cities are forced into using public transit due to economic circumstances. And those are the people who are probably getting pushed out as a result of gentrification.
And the public transit bus routes are designed with this marginal use in mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, the reason you take the bus is because of this, because it's the last resort or something like that.
Exactly. And that is sort of a long-term conversation about public transit, is that if it's done well enough and if the city is designed in a way to support it, then it stops being the last resort. But the other thing that you'll see too, accompany these like public improvements, is also like heavier policing of those public facilities. So you'll have more police on like the subway, or even just people checking whether or not you bought tickets, hostile architecture at the bus stops that keep people from laying down on the benches, or even just sitting comfortably, or just no benches at all. These are issues that need to be contended with, like independent of a leftist critique on some level. It goes hand in hand, I think. Anyway, the reason housing is so important here is because if you don't have stable housing that people can live in without fear of displacement, then your efforts at improving the built environment under a capitalist land and real estate system are going to result in displacement generally of low income people or just people who can't afford the new rents, right? Because every intervention in the built environment is interpreted through the lens of property values. If you give landlords a reason to raise rents, they don't even need a reason oftentimes, but if you give them a reason, they're definitely going to raise rents. And if property values are increasing in the area, that's also a pressure on people from the perspective of property taxes increasing then to levels that might not be affordable to people who do own their homes in those areas, who bought them before gentrification occurred, when prices were a lot more affordable to sort of people with average or, working class, average to below average income, I guess. I don't want to conflate class with income here, but so yeah, that's like the connection between housing and transit. We can do all of these interventions in the built environment, but if we care about justice, making cities a livable place for everybody, then these public improvements are going to be metabolized in a market system that just routinely pushes people out. Yeah, that's kind of a consistent downfall. Just to kind of put a cap on this, it's how you end up, I think, with people who end up being averse to new development in general, because the new development, whether it's increased density improvements to the public transit system or public amenities gets like they feel the genuinely negative effects of the market.
It's not class conscious development. Right?
Exactly.
So there's a problem. And this stigmatizes things. It's a little bit like how right wing populists like NIMBYs. Right wing populists are complaining about why their lives have gone wrong. And they're supplied with, let's say, the wrong explanations. Their sense of grievance is legitimate. But then, let's scapegoat the immigrants or whoever. In this case, when what's happening is they're losing all their cash because of this development. You say, well, it's the development that's the problem. It's not the policy behind the development. Okay, well, that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's kind of how you wind up with a critique of gentrification that revolves around more of the kind of lampooning, sort of the most comedic aspects of sort of liberal white urban culture, which is fair. I love it. At the end of the day, yeah, the $8 coffee shop is annoying, especially like when it probably replaced a beloved local business or community gathering space or what have you. Like the frustration that exists there is legitimate. Ultimately, the preceding business or community gathering space that was a cultural touchstone for that area was pushed out at first, trying to paint a veneer of liberal sort of ideals of like inclusivity, or you put a mural on like a new luxury apartment complex. It's like, is that going to actually change any material conditions? Or are we just kind of paying lip service to awkwardly acknowledging the fact that, yeah, community institutions were displaced by this new development? Now I think we're kind of getting into the territory of like democratized approach to the city and what the right to the city entails. And so I don't want to jump into that.
I was literally like, let's talk about the right to the city. I was like, this was going to be the next thing for me, but it comes in a certain context for me, which is you mentioned way back the use of the idea of the right to the city to justify this very limited policy in Montgomery County. I thought that it was very keen that you were able to point out the allusion to the right to the city, but then its application was in this very limited sense.
Yeah, I can imagine like some planner in the planning department who may well actually be like a socialist and like a David Harvey acolyte or something, kind of like throwing that quote in there, hoping somebody noticed that, and
Can you explain very basically what the right to the city is and its background? And then
yeah, the right to the city, as I understand it, as articulated by David Harvey in his book, The Right to the City, which was sort of my entry point into radical urban thought.
there's also one by Don Mitchell, which said the right to the city and the fight for public space.
Yeah, see, this is kind of where we get into like, I don't want to be like speak with too much authority on the full breadth of the writing about the right to the cities, but I learned about it through The Right to the City by David Harvey. Essentially, as I understand the vision that he articulates there, it's the idea that we as people who live in urban areas are constantly creating and recreating the city. Every day we are contributing to its formation, its character, and the value of the place just by living here and existing in the city. The best way I can imagine to articulate that is when you, I don't know, walk your dog outside at night and people see that, that is a way to communicate a sense of safety, perhaps. When you plant a tree in your front yard, this is going to have reverberating effects on how people perceive your neighborhood, on not just your property value, but the value of property around you. Also, just in a less mundane sense, all of us to different degrees care about where we live and fight to modify our shared space together. Yet we live in a hyper privatized urban context where we actually have a very limited amount of say in how the built environment around us is imagined. So the right to the city gets at the fact that all of us are contributing to urban space, sort of the process of social and economic reproduction in urban space. And yet, in capitalist labor relations, how workers have no say in a capitalist organization of the economy, it similarly happens that we have very little say in the places that we live. So the idea is that taking a more radical approach to democratizing urban space and its organization and development, that's how I understand the right to the city.
That makes me think of the whole process that I've known from, I'm in Maryland, so Maryland DMAs.
Mhm.
You see these kind of cliches, but one of the things that I found particularly aggravating was we don't need more people to give public comments, this stigmatizing dissenters, right? Where you say,
Mhm.
this is for the professionals and the experts and the people that know what they're doing. Get this trouble out of here. And it might not register to people how profoundly contemptuous of democracy that's.
Yeah. And when you get into sort of the higher levels of sort of the people who are actually more directly involved in the production of urban space, you do find a contempt for public input. Under the current system that we have now, again, we've kind of talked about this before. What is critical here to understand is the mode of relation that we have to the space around us, because there are a lot of places that do genuinely make an effort to have public engagement, to reach communities historically disregarded in public engagement processes and sort of steamrolled over in the process of local government. But especially when it comes to private development, you can have all the engagement in the world. But at the end of the day, who owns the piece of land?
Right.
And that's kind of the barrier where I think if we want to talk about sort of a liberal approach to urban development or even a progressive approach to urban development and crossing over into the threshold of like a socialist or just a genuinely left-wing approach to urban space, is this is starting to get out of my depth as far as like specific prescriptions, but changing the mode of relation away from private ownership at sort of the individual or firm level of urban space and bringing things back into the realm of public or common ownership. And that doesn't mean that, your individual house is going to be subject to like power beyond your control as far as, if you want to change your refrigerator to the different color or whatever. Like it means that we have to understand our urban space as collectively produced, because it is. We all live in this space together. We are all playing a role in maintaining these places we call cities, trying to make them worthwhile places to live in. But the avenues for genuinely affecting change in most urban space is limited, and not genuine when there's a private form of ownership at play.
It's funny you say that you feel like you're getting out of your depth, because here at this point, I'm like, well, this one's an easy one. Because now we're talking about challenging capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're going to challenge capitalism, if you can expose the exploitative nature of these relations and explain them to people, I think people can be trusted with that information. I think the success of a lot of liberal pro density is that you invisibilize the capitalist element, right?
Mm-hmm.
You explain it away. But if you can see, oh, hey, look at this, housing politics is just another branch of capitalist politics. And then you're allowed, in my opinion, to zoom out. You can see the relationship between healthcare, housing, and everything else. I think that a politic of human rights is housing a human right? If you can raise that question, if that question can even be raised, that's an incredible advance. As far as I understand, that what the reason I keep bringing up healthcare is because people don't think healthcare is a human right. There are people that do, me and you. You mentioned the slippery slope in your podcast. Then now that guy probably in the City Journal, he would probably say, first they're going to say healthcare is a human right. Tomorrow they're going to say housing is a human right. But then after that, who knows what else is a human right?
Mm-hmm.
So the success of the right wing is to just remove the question of rights altogether from an approach to policy. And I guess our task as organizers would be to help articulate the legitimacy of the politic of rights. It's not as esoteric as we might think. It's like, no, housing is a human right, and we'll figure it out once we can agree on this much.
Yeah.
Now, the real problem there, once the knowledge is there, is the political will. That's where all of these other explanations that have been prepared kind of diffuse people. It'll happen one day. And then you say, I don't need to get engaged because they'll figure it out one day.
Yeah. I think it's really hard. I think especially in the left, when we see so many problems manifest under capitalism that it becomes overwhelming. I regard my podcast, I try to not be too sectarian in my sort of left analysis. Across urban, different urban areas in this country, there are people doing all sorts of great work. It's not my job to be prescriptive about any one particular solution. However, I do think we would really benefit from some manageable solutions that can at least help us chip away and get some wins on the board for our vision. And I think, I've been pondering, I haven't done any reading on this. The way things went down in the 2008 financial crisis, the banks got bailed out, but so many people ended up still losing their homes through the foreclosure process because homeowners were not bailed out. And I think, yes, we could have just bailed out homeowners and made sure that they had enough cash in hand to make their mortgage payments, sort of slap a Band-Aid on things. But one of the most important things that we can do is find ways to bring land back into sort of public or common control. And there are a lot of different ways to go about that. Occupancy requirements for multi-unit residential properties over a certain number of units. If landlords fail to meet the occupancy requirements, then there are consequences. If you don't hit 90% occupancy in your buildings, then we're just going to repossess your property and turn it into public housing. Or at least that's the dream in my mind. There is so much rental housing in disrepair in this country because there's no pressure on landlords to fix the plumbing or the electrical systems or the holes in the windows or whatever. That was something else that we canvassed about in the tenants union back in my college town. Basically creating consequences that are not just fines, but actually repossession for failure of property owners in the market to maintain their properties or meet occupancy requirements. The irony of talking about density under a capitalist system is that a lot of the quote unquote dense buildings are not getting rented. Especially you see this in Los Angeles and the Bay Area and Seattle, but it happens everywhere, New York too. We don't really track this well without these policies. First things first, I would love to see detailed tracking about how many people are actually living in these new skyscrapers and luxury housing developments, because with as many as are going up, there's not that big of a market for them to be occupied with the number of units that are being built. But they're stores of wealth for excess capital. They're supposedly good investment opportunities. So that's why they get built. You can actually force these landlords to drive down their rents to the point that people can afford to live in the housing rather than just sitting on it. So at least that's a downward pressure on rents. And if they fail to do that, or if their property falls into disrepair, ideally that property just becomes public housing, right? Falls under public control. It's rehabbed and it's affordable for people to live in then, right? I think that is a tangible way. I think, again, I want to read more about this. It seems to me that's a really tangible way to grow our public housing stock and increase the amount of land that is, again, under public control and that we actually have a say over. If your city has a public housing authority, there are people either appointed to it or elected to it by your elected officials. There's a literal avenue for democratic control over this housing stock then. Where I'm from, Omaha, the leader of the public housing organization was literally my job is to make sure that this doesn't exist. But so far the market has failed to eliminate the need for public housing. You're going to be waiting a long time, guy. To get back to the housing crisis, for people who are going into foreclosure, that is a really difficult situation to be in. I think there's an opportunity there to bail them out and say the government will wipe out your home loan basically, but your house is going to then become part of a public housing stock. Not everybody's going to opt into that. But I think for people who are having to make the choice between being kicked out of their house by their bank or given the opportunity to stay in their home and probably be able to rehab it too if they need that, that's like a pretty good option because the alternative is homelessness or going back to becoming a renter. Again, in this way, we can grow the amount of public housing stock and public land. This is kind of where I put on like my planner hat. The most important part is making sure people have a place to live. But over the long term, if you own the land that that housing is on, then you're able to democratically redevelop that land if people believe that's the right thing to do. Maybe over the long term, we can claw back some of the suburban sprawl too. If we start being able to pick up properties in the suburbs and, low density areas over time, that creates a level of control over those properties where they're still useful as housing. People aren't getting kicked out of their houses, but over the long term, there's the potential to have direct say in how that land gets used. Again, this is not like a well thought out idea, I guess, but I feel like we're at that point where we need some practical policy options to pursue that are manageable. I'm not really waiting for like the revolution, I think the revolution is what we make of it. And you can view it as a single instance of sort of massive social and economic change, or you can understand the revolution as banding together with your neighbors to get somebody's security deposit back, or fighting for these policies that maybe are not transformational in the short term, but in the aggregate over the long term can actually be disruptive. My hope on my podcast, like I said, is to get into all sorts of different sort of prescriptions or ideas about manageable ways for us to claw back private space and increase democratic control over urban space, which is desperately needed.
I can hear, and I'm going to round the corner on this and then we'll close it out. This has been wonderful for me and I deeply appreciate it. I could hear people say, why aren't you talking about zoning? And that's where the battleground is. It's going to be in reforming zoning laws. When I think about advancing the notion of reality of human rights, it feels like it's a little bit beyond that for me personally. But I think speaking to that concern would be helpful for people.
Yeah. I don't want my lack of mentioning zoning to be misconstrued as me not caring about zoning. My background is in urban planning. I looked at zoning as a concept and said, yeah, I'm comfortable dealing with that for the rest of my life. And I think zoning as a concept is generally good. If we look at how urban space was at the beginning of the 20th century in the United States, we need to have some sort of check on where industrial use is happening versus like residential use, because we know the environmental consequences and the health consequences. Not having that level of organization in urban space is not good. But I know you're getting more at concepts like upzoning or eliminating single family zoning, things like that, not the sort of baseline concept of zoning. Just want to be clear. This podcast is generally pro zoning. I'm not going to defend it in all its forms, but the concept of it, sure. It gets to kind of what we've been talking about during this conversation. I think zoning as a tool is what politics makes of it. I think a lot of people want it to be a sort of technocratic silver bullet, where if we allow upzoning, if we eliminate single family zoning, that is going to unleash a wave of missing middle housing that will sort of solve the affordability crisis.
It's treated like a secret key. It's the missing ingredient to all of this.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I want to see more duplexes and townhouses, cottage clusters and accessory dwelling units and all of that. That is not just important from a density perspective. Something else that kind of needs to be talked about is how a private land system doesn't create housing for people of all different sort of family compositions and physical needs. We need places where like large multi-generational families can find a place to like all live together. We need housing where elderly parents can live in a separate housing unit that is near enough to their children who are maybe their caretaker when they need it. I don't want to understate the importance of the form of housing. We have to get past this mindset that form is going to solve affordability or the issue of displacement. I think we have enough evidence at this point. We have incredibly dense cities in this country already as evidence that, like, a shoebox in New York City is wildly expensive. And people just say, well, the cost of living there is higher. But it's like, no, it's literally the real estate market pushing up to absurdly high level. It doesn't have to be that way. We can see how building smaller and building denser does not actually yield. It may cut down costs for the developer, but they're ultimately going to sell or rent the property for as high of a price as they can get it. No amount of messing with the form of the housing is going to change that. So I'm on board with eliminating the hegemony of single family housing in this country, single family zoning, because we know the racist and segregationist history behind the single family zoning as a concept, but also we need to be willing to recognize that townhouses are not going to save us. When it gets down to the mode of relation, who owns the land and who gets a say in who lives there, how much it costs to live there, that's just the bottom line of it. Actually, I think it's important to talk about how zoning can be a tool to push for affordable housing. You see this across the country, more transit-oriented development zoning overlay districts, which, like, if you thought zoning was a snooze, wait until you learn about overlay districts and special zoning districts. It takes a certain kind of person to look at that and be interested in engaging with it. But zoning can be an avenue for pushing for affordable housing requirements, right? It can do that. And that's great. I would never advocate against that. So if there's a fight in your community for things like transit-oriented development or upzoning or things like that, try and push for affordable housing requirements in there, because that is an established concept, even among like planning thought and urban thought as it exists in where we are right now, right? Some of the other stuff that I've talked about is not necessarily in like the mainstream of planning or urban thought at this point. It's recognizable to say we should have affordable housing requirements in like a transit-oriented development zoning overlay district or something.
This has been incredibly comprehensive for me. Here's my honest impression. It's like, wow, I couldn't get David Harvey, but I could get this person. So I'm very happy.
If you can get David Harvey, you should talk to David Harvey. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'll reach out to you if I get it too. And we can bother him together because you guys will have more to talk about than
Oh my
me.
gosh, that would be amazing. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come on. This is my very first interview that I've ever done for the podcast.
So can you tell people where to find you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at zoned_out_podcast. I'm at Tumblr or I don't know. Just search Zoned Out Podcast on Tumblr. You'll find it. And if you like the show enough to throw some money my way, I have a Patreon too. Patreon.com/zoned out podcast. You can find the podcast on all of the streaming services.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay.